Waliaksipug. Good morning. Nim Deluisi Maldeles, Nina Megama, Nim Deluisi Booktaway Ebidez. What I said is my English name is Teresa Edwards, and my Mi'kmaq name is Young Firewoman. So I get to keep that name because I have a very young or youthful or juvenile sometimes spirit, and so that's the name that was given to me by my elders. And I am from a member of the Listigut First Nation, and it's important for me to acknowledge where I come from so I can begin to talk to you about other things. I have to place myself in the world, and I also want to acknowledge the elder for the great opening this morning. I hadn't had coffee yet, so my singing was quite low. Hadn't found my voice yet, and I want to acknowledge the Mohawk people on whose territory we're gathered here today. So I have all kinds of things up here, but I'm thinking, do I get to click to see the presentation? Okay, so I don't need the hard copy. There was a couple of things I wanted to mention. When you're working in this area, and especially as an Aboriginal person, you develop a lot of resiliency, and I think that's something that saw us through many challenges. And one of those tools for resiliency is our humor. And so in both my department, International Affairs and Human Rights, and in the Violence Prevention directorates, you'll hear the most laughter. And if an outsider were to come in, they think they're dealing with all these heavy topics. How is it that they're laughing? But that's what gets us through, right? So I had to share this with you, that my staff, and I asked them, I was racing against the clock, and I know Joy and Linda did amazing work in getting this all together. They were asking with the prompts, can you send your bio? Can you send your picture? All these things, and they were very patient when I was taking longer than expected to get back to them. So I had asked my staff, can you pick out a picture and send it? And I didn't realize I sent two, or they sent two, and I forwarded them without really looking at them, and I said, choose whichever one. And it was only later when I saw it in the book. Now you can't see, but this is my staff's sense of humor, because they're such teasers. I'm actually wearing a crown in that picture. So, it's a serious topic when I've got a tiara on my head. It was at our AGA, so I had to start with that to remember to keep light when we're talking about this topic. And also another point, just to mention the place that I'm starting from is from a place of non-judgment, and we're really trying to be as supportive as possible for the women in our communities. And by that I mean on, off reserve, status, non-status, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, who are particularly vulnerable. And one of the things that we've really embraced and tried to tie to everything that we present is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So I'm a human rights defender, and I should have worn my cape. That's another thing we did for Halloween. We dressed up as the UN Declaration. And so I should have brought that cape today. But what we've done, and there's some on the back of the table, but I didn't bring that many because I did come right from the UN last night, so I left a lot of my materials there that I had distributed. But what it is it's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Prostitution, and it talks about the links of trying to achieve more for our women in the sense of creating more options for our women. So when you don't have options, you don't have choice. And I know this is specific to trafficking, and I'll get into the connection with the two. And then we have our campaign about equality and solidarity, and we want more for women. And we want more than prostitution for women, and we also want more for prostituted women. And then, of course, this one, Canada can do better for prostituted women, and it's a postcard that you can send in as well. So those are at the back of the table. I also have the UN DRIP posters at my office, and we just ask that you cover the cost of shipping, and I'd be glad to share those with you, the bilingual, as well as the booklets that you can carry easily in your purse, so you too can be a human rights defender. So it's Human Trafficking Forum addressing human trafficking in Aboriginal communities. And this, I put my name, but also to acknowledge the student that I've been working with and who is now at the UN with the president and the executive director in my absence. So Nicole Bresser, otherwise known as Nikki Bresser, she is doing, as part of the program, First Nations Government's third-year law school at York, actually in Toronto, and she's doing her stage at NWAC, so she helped me in this, so I wanted to acknowledge her important role. So just to tell you quickly a little bit about NWAC, if you don't know who the Native Women's Association of Canada, I'd like to think that you all know who NWAC is, but I met with CSC last week, and a woman stood up that's been working there for 20 years and said she had no idea who NWAC was, and this was in Ottawa. So anyway, it's all about public education. So who is NWAC? We're the National Voice of Aboriginal Women in Canada, and we've been incorporated since 1974. So we've been doing this type of work, bringing forward the rights of Aboriginal women for almost 40 years now. And our membership consists of a network of 12 provincial territorial associations from across Canada. We're working on having one in New Brunswick as well as Manitoba this year, so hopefully that'll bump up to 14. A little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. As I mentioned, who is NWAC, what is human trafficking, which you're all aware of, why are Aboriginal women targets for traffickers, the intersection with law enforcement, NWAC's missing and murdered women research, and then some responses and recommendations that have come out from the last 40 years of NWAC's work with Aboriginal women. So when we look at human trafficking, I brought up Joy Smith's research to say, she spoke about human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, harboring of persons for the purpose of exploitation, typically in the sex trade, that's her perception. Over the past few years, it's been the fastest growing and most lucrative criminal enterprises. Here in Canada, we're beginning to awake to the realities of this horrific crime, from young girls taken from the streets of Montreal and sold abroad to the vulnerable children taken from our First Nation reserves and also off reserve. It is a crime that reaches all elements of our society. And why I make the link with prostitution and human trafficking is when we look at the definition of being trafficked and the three new offenses, we talk about that there's recruitment, transportation, transfer, receive, hold, or hiding a person, exercising control over, direct influence over an adult or a minor's movements for the purpose of exploiting, benefit materially from human trafficking, so of course living off the avails, withhold or destroy a person's travel or identification documents such as passport, visa, for the purpose of trafficking. And then when we look at women who are prostituted, we talk about this myth of free choice. And I'm not trying to engage in the debate of women who are adults and who choose this as an economic means. When I talk about the myth of free choice, I talk about girls who have been trafficked from the age of 8, 9, 10 years old, and they've been sexually exploited, trauma after trauma, until they reach the age of 18. And at what point do they then have a choice? Because they've turned 18, we're now referring to them as prostitutes as opposed to as being prostituted as opposed to being trafficked. It's very distinct when it comes to Aboriginal communities, and I'll get into some of the reasons why it's a totally different circumstance when we're talking about Aboriginal women. And then we look at the Ontario Court of Appeal overturning the laws in the Bedford, and now the appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada in the fall, the Bedford case, and NWAC is an intervener on that, and that's what some of the public education materials are about for that. Now, when you think of the common image of women being trafficked, you think of something like this, where human trafficking is slavery, men, women, and children are being sold and forced into labor and prostitution, and she can't ask for help. What I'm talking about is the untold image of Aboriginal women in Canada. It's Aboriginal girls and women who are specifically targeted in this country to be trafficked in such huge numbers that it does not compare to other populations. The average age of girls being trafficked are between 7 and 12 years old. This was taken from an interim executive director of the Métis Settlement General Counsel in Edmonton. And we have other women that have reported to us at the national office. And this is an area of work that's not funded. We all, each of our directorates, whether it be health, mine and human rights and international affairs, or the violence prevention director, all work in the area of trafficking because the work overlaps, but they are not paid files. It's all things that we do over and above because they're so entrenched in the situation of Aboriginal women and the violence that they face, that we must absolutely continue to address it from every angle. So why are Aboriginal women at risk? We look at violence and victimization and how violence can take on many forms: physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, spiritual, cultural, financial. And this often results in their vulnerability, their self-harm, depression, cycle of violence, alcohol, drug abuse, suicide. And before we can even get to this stage, it's like looking at an egg, for example. You have to peel the shell off so that you can start to see how that egg became the egg in the first place. And we look at the experiences of violence, such as Aboriginal women being 8 times more likely to be killed than non-Aboriginal women, rates of spousal assault that are more than 3 times higher than non-Aboriginal women, and more severe and potentially life-threatening forms of spousal violence, 54% versus 37% of non-Aboriginal women. Now, if you just were to look at those stats that I referred to, you might think, well, this is violence that's going on in the Aboriginal community, and you might want to put it in a nice, neat little box and say, this is just an Aboriginal problem. However, more than half of our women are married to non-Aboriginal men. So it's not that this is something that's going on just on reserve, that it's something that's going on within Aboriginal communities. It's going on throughout Canada, and there's a huge link to the fact that there is a devaluing of Aboriginal women, but for the fact that they are Aboriginal and they are women, and the intersection of the two. And this plays out in society, in policing, with institutions, and with racism writ large. And we see that still today. It was mentioned earlier this week, I've been at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, specifically because this year's theme is on addressing violence against women. And I ran into my colleagues from the former department that I'm on interchange from, the Status of Women Canada. So I've worked for the feds for 10 years, and now I've been with NWAC for almost 4, and we'll be there almost 3, and I'll be there for at least another year and a half. And so my colleagues said, this is the Commission on the Status of Women, why would NWAC go? And that really struck me, because I thought, no, this is a huge this impacts on Indigenous women in an unbelievable way. So to not even address that concept at such a huge event is leaving out a whole population. And we were fortunate enough to gather in a hallway because there was no room that we could book, but we met with Indigenous women from at least 16 other countries, and spoke for about an hour of how to strategize and influence the recommendations that will come from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And what really struck me as well was that the Indigenous women from countries like Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, Malaysia, they said, oh, well, we know Canada and Australia, your governments, there's no hope for you guys trying to influence anything because you're in such a sad state of affairs. And I thought, that's what the world, right? They do know Canada. That's what the world, these Indigenous women are saying about Canada, Australia, New Zealand, right? And because they were saying, go try and approach your government and see if in the second paragraph of the UN Commission on the Status of Women recommendations, when we talk about adhering to legislation, if we can have in there the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I said, so people were all talking and they said, well, Canada's signed off, but they know that wouldn't be something that would be placed in that second paragraph. However, we did meet with the government officials to ask if they would object if another country put it forward. So we've worked with Norway and other Indigenous countries, or Indigenous women from those countries, who they will try to influence their government to put that issue on the table. So we'll see how it plays out by the end of this week. But just some interesting things to note when you think about global connections. So again, going back about the distinct experience of Aboriginal women in violence, it's likely to go unreported in 60% of cases, and it's often linked to circumstances of vulnerability, low income, housing insecurity, youth, the geography, sex. When the effects of all factors are controlled, Aboriginal peoples are still 3 times more likely to experience violence. When I recently made a presentation to the Standing Committee on it was changes to the Employment Insurance Act, in brackets, incarceration. I made the comment about Aboriginal people, especially women, are in prison or incarcerated due to poverty offenses. And actually, it wasn't at that one. It was the year before at the Rights of Off Reserves. And one of the senators said to me, "Ms. Edwards, you keep referring to poverty and crime as if they're related." And they were serious, right? So, yeah, other areas of vulnerability for Aboriginal people. And where does this come from? Is it because Aboriginal people are all committing more crimes and are addicted and are choosing this marginalization? No, it's the ongoing impacts of intergenerational trauma coming from Indian residential schools, not 100 years ago. That's a common experience from people. Oh, we've got to get over it. That was over 100 years ago. No, the last Indian residential school closed in 1996. 1996, so it's within all of our lifetimes. Where there was a forced loss of language and culture, traditional values, ongoing sexual abuse, difficulty in bonding with others and forming relationships. And these are the consequences that came from those children who survived that abuse for 10 years or less or more. The lack of parenting and life skills, loss of self-respect, the shame, use of drugs to bury and cope with those painful memories. And then more than 40% of Aboriginal women in prison have been to Indian residential schools, and more than that have been placed in care of parents who were in Indian residential schools. So often people refer to the 60s scoop, where governments went into Aboriginal families and took children from their home and were placed into care. But I challenge, yes, that did happen. Since then, we had Indian residential schools, and post-Indian residential schools today, as Cindy Blackstock from the First Nations Caring Society has brought forward, that there are more children in care right now in 2013 than there were in Indian residential schools. So if you think about that for a moment, it really, and we know the negative effects that it had from removing children from their families, communities, language, culture, spiritual beliefs, and then now we're doing more than that. I believe Cindy's stat is 8 times more than were Indian residential schools. It may even be higher. So when we think of those potential impacts for the next few generations on our communities of those children, and then there's huge links to FASD of our children and those children being recruited into gangs and as well as being trafficked. So there's trends that have been identified that show that Aboriginal girls are forced into situations or to use coping strategies that increase their vulnerability to violence, such as hitchhiking. I remember there was this floating the idea of a campaign, and RCMP actually has worked with NWAC to do a hitchhiking campaign that is very real, and it's about harm reduction and meeting women with where they're at, because it actually recognizes the fact that there are 633 communities in this country that many of them don't have access for transportation for women to go back and forth. There aren't buses, and if women want to visit family, if they want to attend community events, funerals, weddings, anything like that, they will hitchhike. So we've actually, that is one little success that we've done in collaboration with the RCMP, is the hitchhiking campaign that talks about women saying, if you're going to hitchhike, text a friend, tell them the license plate number, tell them where you're going, what time, and so sharing information or traveling with someone else. Because I remember previously the government, one of the campaigns they were thinking was, it made it blame the victim. It was talking about missing and murdered women and saying, well, if they would just stop hitchhiking, it's not, if we would just catch the serial killers, it was if the women would just stop hitchhiking. So some of the other things that increase their vulnerability, addictions, as I said, the fact that there's unsafe housing or homelessness, prostitution or being exploited in the sex trade, gang involvement, trafficking, sexual exploitation, abusive relationships. That's another project that's just started with NWAC, is boyfriend or not. A lot of our women who have sustained so much trauma as youth, by the time they're 13, they think, or they claim the abuse that they're being trafficked by their boyfriend, when in fact he is their pimp. So youth experience multiple forms of abuse or violence: sexual, physical, emotional, cultural, spiritual, and of course lateral violence. They can have addictions and mental health issues, like I mentioned with FASD, gang involvement, and victims of trafficking. So sexual exploitation of youth, and then they come of age, as I mentioned, and then higher rates of suicide. And we talk about the intersections of ethnicity, sex, and class. So social and economic marginalization of Aboriginal people persists. We know billions of dollars have gone into addressing violence against Aboriginal women, and with increasing violence against them. So our new, well, it's not new, but the area that we're seeming to make some progress with is to look at economic security for Aboriginal women, whether it be in trades, skill development, financial literacy. Even our women are very skilled with financial literacy, being able to survive with next to nothing, but to give them more tools. When we look at the Government of Canada's recent investments over the last 4 years, it's something like $400 million for Aboriginal economic development. And we looked at what is going specifically to women. I think we discovered something like 17,000 of that, and we're more than half the population. So of course you're not going to see a change in our economic security across Canada because the investments are not being made into women or creating options for women to escape poverty. Aboriginal women continue to face racism and sexism. This is an ongoing fact. I mean, again, after years of credibility, and I like to think that it's not retaliation, but yeah, we'll just leave it at that. NWAC has made world headway in raising the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. This is not anything that's new. 2004, Amnesty International spoke about the high rates of missing and murdered women. This should not be a contested issue. And for the first time ever in history, over 210 international human rights and equality-seeking organizations wrote to the UN Commission, the UN Committee, the CEDAW Committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, to have them come to Canada to do an investigation, to do some kind of an inquiry into this situation. I raise all this because it's linked to women in trafficking and their marginalization. And with that, we had the RCMP recent comments made trying to discredit NWAC. Well, actually, to the RCMP's defense, we'll say, because we do have a partnership with them, we try to work in collaboration with them. When we spoke to them, they actually forwarded the quote that was given to the media, and it was taken out of context and sort of media did what they do to raise a bit of controversy. So it was taken out of the comments by the RCMP were taken out of context to raise this attention, and it impacted it had the effect of discrediting or trying to discredit NWAC's numbers, which for us was totally a shock that we would have this come out in 2013 when all of our reports had been out in 2010, and the database hasn't gone on since then. So if ever there was a problem disputing the numbers, why weren't they raised then? And the government's gone on. We've done audit after audit, and all our reports and accountability, as was referred to, for an NGO, and we were funded again to do another 4-year project. So if there was ever a problem, we certainly would never have received funding again. But that is something, you could look at something like that and say it's a bit of a retaliation, because we're actually raising awareness and public education about the extreme racism and marginalization against Native women in this country. But maybe it was just a misunderstanding. So we're having increased contact with the justice system as victims, witnesses, those charged, sentenced, and serving time. We're trying to build partnerships across the country to create tools for women on the ground so that GLADU principles are taken into account. So the full context, holistic approach of an Aboriginal woman's life when she gets in conflict with the law, or any individual woman or man that's Aboriginal, to prevent the high rates that are increasing of our people in prisons. So some of the supporting statistics, 90% of women in the downtown east side in Vancouver who are involved in prostitution are Aboriginal. 4 out of 5 women in Aboriginal communities will be sexually abused. 82% of Aboriginal women involved in the sex trade are in urgent need of drug and alcohol treatment. These all come from Statistics Canada. 52.1% of all Aboriginal children live in extreme poverty. 80 to 90% of Aboriginal mothers in Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatoon are single mothers and live below the poverty level. 53% of children on social workers' caseloads are Aboriginal, and 12.5 times more likely to be in care. So it was higher than oh, no, that's a different stat. 12.5 times more likely to be in care than non-Aboriginal children. As I mentioned, our women are over-policed and under-protected. Aboriginal people in the justice system are classified at higher risk, higher need. 1 out of 3, so 33%, new female offenders in the federal correction system are Aboriginal. And if you look at the offenses, they're not in there for violent offenses. They're in there for poverty offenses, such as prostitution, fraud, theft, things like that. So you have a disproportionate number of missing and murdered women in Canada that are Aboriginal. And we've come to learn over the last 5 years that's true in North America, so it's in the US as well, but they haven't had the opportunity to gather the statistics. And we're also hearing anecdotally that that's the case in Mexico as well, that there's extreme rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women there. So some of NWAC's work, as I already mentioned, the evidence is from Aboriginal families and public fora, where we found more than 500 missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls in Canada. And it was all started originally, so the last number was 582 when our database stopped in 2010. It originally started from the Highway of Tears, and our former president, Terry Brown, who had lost a family member who had been murdered, and she originally started the campaign Stolen Sisters on February 14th, and from there Amnesty came out with their Stolen Sisters report, and after that NWAC launched a 5-year public education awareness campaign called Sisters in Spirit, And as I mentioned, they've been funded since, that directorate, to do evidence to action. So the process involved gathering life stories from the families and gathering statistical information. The aim was to understand the circumstances, root causes, trends surrounding missing and murdered Aboriginal women so that we could find out ways to prevent further women from being vulnerable to being murdered. The value was in successfully to relay our findings to the families, the Aboriginal communities, the general public, and provincial, territorial, federal, territorial governments to promote the safety and well-being of our women. So what was the Sisters in Spirit database? It had approximately 250 variables that organized according to 4 themes. It listed demographic information, life experiences of the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls, incident information, and trial information. So it was never aimed to replace police reporting. It was always meant to validate the claims of the family, to document the experience that the families had when interacting with the justice system, and also to find out who these women were so that every statistic represented a woman's life and it wasn't just another number. So as of March 31st, as I mentioned, there was 582 missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls in Canada, and there were 70 cases in Ontario. 80% are women or girls who have been murdered, and 14% were women or girls who are missing. Data from Ontario reveals that it's not simply a problem in Western provinces, and the remaining amount were unknown or uncertain. So most cases occur in urban areas. Again, it's getting away from this notion that this is a strictly Aboriginal problem and it's on reserve. 70% of Aboriginal women and girls go missing from urban areas, and 22% of Aboriginal women and girls go missing in rural areas, and 8% go missing from on reserve. So what have we learned from all this? Where can we go? What good can we do? Today, I got up this morning and did out a reminder memo for my 2 bosses, the executive director, Claudette Dumont-Smith, and our president, Michelle Odette, who are in New York. They're actually taking an opportunity from today's meeting. So I was talking to someone about what types of things you do there. And it's an opportunity to meet with other groups. There's over 475 NGO events that are going on. So it's absolutely an incredible experience to find out best practices, what's working, where, and how it can benefit our people. But also, sometimes it's an opportunity to meet with people from Canada or Ottawa specifically in a location where you're not being constantly interrupted. So today, the President and ED are meeting with the NDP, Jean Crowder and Nikki Ashton, to talk about the new committee that's been announced, a special committee on missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And the reason that NWAC is talking with them is because we want to say that this isn't the end of the line. This is just a small step to keep this issue in the public eye. We absolutely want a national public inquiry, and the reason for that is so that we can have accountability, and it can no longer be denied, and that no one can claim this is a NWAC statistics, these aren't credible. Then it can be resolved once and for all that there is in fact a situation of violence that targets Aboriginal women here in Canada. And for a whole host of other reasons, we have a chart on our website that you could visit so that you could see what the benefit would be out of having a national public inquiry as opposed to a task force or anything else like that. So the special committee, we realize that it's going ahead, and there's currently 7 Conservative members, 4 NDP and 1 Liberal, okay, that will be on that committee. So we need to influence it to say, what are the outcomes going to be? Who are the witnesses that you're going to speak to? Please don't speak with one individual person who is going to recount their own experience. We don't want to re-traumatize families. We want to talk to people who have been working with women, again, because there is a strong link with women who are trafficked and women who are being prostituted. We want to, and missing and murdered. we want to ensure that the witnesses that they're bringing forward have full knowledge of the situation and experience of those women, and that the outcomes will be meaningful. They recently, a few years ago, did a violence against women report, and they did not meet with any of the specialists, or not many of the specialists that were working in this area. So we want to ensure it's not just another report that collects dust, and that it's a step in the right direction. So some of the factors we want to consider: that services are not always available to those who need help, and that there are funding shortages and programming, that we need to have services that are long-term and culturally appropriate, supportive and accessible for our women. And we want families to connect with other families and offer them guidance and information. Supports need to differ and change over time. So just to recap quickly, in 2004, we saw there was this human rights crisis in our own backyard. 2005, we had the international and Canadian communities began to listen to the voices of Aboriginal women and families, and were pressured. The government had pressure to take action. And then from 2006 until present, women and families began a movement of social change and taking action. And today, communities across Canada are standing up for justice, to raise awareness and to promote safety for Aboriginal women. And we need to talk about building trust. Why was NWAC so needed? Because the relationship, women didn't feel safe to report, whether it was that they were being trafficked, whether that they had experienced violence, and NWAC was a safer means that they could disclose to. But as I say, in our database, the numbers that we took were all public information or came from families who had also disclosed to police. It's just that the RCMP and the Provincial Territorial Police had not brought their data together, documenting race and gender in a holistic way, so they didn't have the same numbers that we did. It takes time to develop, as you all know, the relationships and trust with families and communities. And still today, that's one of our struggles when everyone is saying, hand over your list, NWAC. We still do not have permission from all the families to distribute all the personal information that came from the women and girls in the database. So we can't share that with the public. We need to continue to improve the socioeconomic outcomes for Aboriginal women and families. That's the number one investment we want to make in our women to prevent them from being trafficked. We know education, that helps women, helps girls. The investment in education has helped girls. However, that's not translating into their economic security. So here you have Aboriginal boys that are making more, Aboriginal boys are reaching less academic levels than girls. However, they're earning higher incomes as young men and men than Aboriginal girls and women, which puts them at vulnerability of achieving socioeconomic security. We need leadership at all levels to speak out, hence the meeting with the NDP today, and we've met with Carol Ann Bennett as well to speak out about the particular vulnerability of Aboriginal women at being trafficked. And men must take a stand and be a part of the solution. As Aboriginal peoples, we are distinct in that as well, in that we see our men as part of our entire community, and any response or any action that we take has to be done in unison with them for it to make a change. And in our mothering of our boys. We need this ongoing recognition that this is an issue affecting all Canadians through a national public inquiry and implementation of a strategic plan of action. When we talk about this plan of action, we want it to be consistent with the UN's plan of action to address violence against women, 2014 or 15, I think it is. What can you do? You can create partnerships with police, justice officials, educators, community groups, unions, equality-seeking organizations, human rights, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal groups. Have community engagement, so it's back and forth, not having government officials or organizations thinking they have the best solution for our people. Any solutions that are derived without the constant back and forth of our people or being led by our people will be a complete failure, I guarantee you that. And that would have saved governments billions of dollars if they engaged our people or let our people lead in initiatives that impact on them. So that's one piece of wisdom that we've learned from our ongoing engagement. We need to recognize the strength, the value of culture and tradition in helping our people heal. We need to involve elders, youth, traditional practices in all solutions that are being implemented. That's something that can't be lost. Our elders are linked to the past, and our youth are linked to the future. We need to teach police how to respect our culture, protocols, and that they can benefit from any process to improve relationships with them and Aboriginal families and communities. Social change begins with one step. I know I'm out of town, so out of time, and I've got to go out of town. Sorry. But so we have the evolution of Sisters in Spirit, tools that have come from that we have developed for families, communities, to work with police, to work with media, to work within the justice system, and how to create violence. We have a violence prevention toolkit. We have community supports. We're trying to develop resource manuals and programs for women on the street. So these are just some helpful questions. Ask yourself, what's the problem I want to solve? What are the community's needs? What can I do to reach this goal? How can I influence the outcome? Are there strategies for success? Is there anything that I assumed in this plan? Because we all know what assume means, right? And how will I work with the youth and elders? And these are really long, so I don't want to get into them, but just if you looked at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, if nothing else, if you looked at that UN Declaration and used that as a roadmap to guide all your work in dealing with the issue of trafficking and Indigenous people, I would suggest you can't go wrong if you were to use that as your guide. And you'll all have access. These are all things that I've touched on, the community problem solving, supports. And again, if you're doing programming or services for Aboriginal peoples, be sure that it means peoples and not just men. I don't mind if the program's just for men, but just say that it's just for men, because as I said, the investments in Aboriginal economic development, $500 million over 4 years, and 17,000 goes to the women. We need to ensure that a gender analysis is done of every program and service that's meant to change things for our people. The national plan to be developed to improve the lives of Aboriginal women. Increased collaboration between correctional institutions, schools, social service agencies, the Aboriginal community, widespread education of all Canadians about the truth of residential schools and the impacts on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women and men, a commitment of targeted funds to ensure gender-specific recommendations arising from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation, and then, of course, the inclusion of Aboriginal women in decision-making in regards to policy strategies that will affect them and their collective rights in Aboriginal people overall. Thank you.